To talk about frequently used acronyms, the definitions of accommodations and modifications, and the difference between the two. And we'll talk about some scenarios and examples of each. So, we don't really use a whole lot of acronyms, but in case you hear me use one, hopefully it's going to be one of these, right? IDEA, because I use these a lot. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's the federal special education law. IEP is the Individualized Education Plan or Program. That's the plan that directs all special education services and what they call ESY, Extended School Year Services. LRE is the Least Restrictive Environment. That's the place your child should receive their education. And then LEA is your local education agency. That's your public school district in your parish. Some children on an IEP need accommodations and or modifications to receive the full benefit of their education. It's not an unfair advantage. It's all about access. Accommodations in the classroom are like a ramp for somebody with a wheelchair. The IEP team that develops the child's individualized plan needs to think about how they can help the student be successful in accessing the general education curriculum. The term accommodation might be used to describe a change in the environment, the way information is presented, equipment used to teach something to a student with exceptionality, so that they can access the information being taught or complete an assigned task. Those changes or accommodations allow students with exceptionalities to learn all the same things their other students are learning in school. Those changes are not ones that change what's taught. They're changes that help a student access information being presented. Let's talk about a few examples of this. One might be sign language or interpreters for students who are deaf. Another one might be computer text-to-speech, computer-based systems for students with visual impairments or dyslexia. Another one might be extended time for students with difficulties writing, or they might have visual impairments, or they might have learning disorders. Large print books and worksheets for students with visual impairments are one. And another one might be trackballs or alternative keyboards for students who can't operate standard mice or keyboards. The term modification is different. Modification means a change to what is being taught. Modifications are made for students with exceptionalities who aren't able to understand all of the information regular education students are taught. So, for example, assignments might be changed or modified a lot for an elementary student with learning differences that make it hard to understand the information taught to the general education students. Let's go into some examples of these that you might see on an IEP. Allowing outlining instead of writing an entire essay or a major project. Or another one might be using alternate books or materials on the topic that's being studied. Another one of those examples is a project instead of a written report. And then maybe a fourth example would be film or video supplements instead of reading text. Accommodations change how the student learns, not what they learn, and the ways that they show what they've learned. Modifications change at least some of what the student is learning or the assignments that they complete. Every student with an IEP doesn't need the same accommodations or modifications. It shouldn't look the same from one person's IEP to the next. Just like the IEP goals, accommodations and modifications need to be specific to meet each student and their specific needs. It's important that students receive appropriate accommodations to maximize their access to the general education curriculum. A special education class should already be making accommodations and modifications for students. However, the general education teacher depends on the expertise of the special education teacher and the IEP team to decide what extra accommodation and modifications are needed for students with exceptionalities. Any student using or needing assistive technology to access the same lessons the other students are being taught should be provided the tools they need. Also, students who need classroom accommodations probably need the same ones on state testing. Therefore, it's important that accommodations and accommodations are noted on the IEP document. But let's go over some basic scenarios. Find your chat box and take a look at the picture. We're going to make the assumption that the student in the wheelchair is learning what everyone else is learning. But he's in a wheelchair, and the others are in classroom chairs. So is the student receiving an accommodation or a modification? Type A into the chat for accommodation and M for modification. And I'll give you a few minutes. Okay, a few seconds. Okay, if you said accommodation, you're correct. His wheelchair is an accommodation. Now let's assume the class is on the second floor. Another accommodation might be an elevator to access that classroom. But maybe he's in an old school and it doesn't have an elevator. His accommodation would be for the classroom to be moved downstairs to an accessible part of the building. An accommodation just allows the student access to the material that everyone else is learning. Let's go to another one. Look at this picture. This is a middle school English language arts class. The students are divided into different groups. While the students at the back table are reading a grade level book and journaling, the students in the front are working on a collage project to show they understood what they understood about the story on the same topic that was read by the teacher. Would it be an accommodation or a modification? A for accommodation, M for modification. And I'm going to give you a few seconds again to type it into the chat. Participation. Okay, so this would be considered a modification because they're significantly changing what the student is learning. So the teacher read that one group a whole different story and they're doing a collage about what they understood. That's a big change to what the students are learning. Okay? And y'all chat us up if y'all have questions. One more example. This is the last picture for me. And again, put it in your chat box. Is the student using the calculator receiving a modification or accommodation? So chat me in the chat box. Okay, on the picture on the left, the student is receiving an accommodation to do the same math work everyone else is working on. His accommodation is the use of a calculator. We can figure that out because nobody else has a calculator in there, in that picture. On the right, everybody's using a calculator. Even though the same calculator is an accommodation on the left, it really isn't one on the right because all students are allowed to use it. But I do have one caveat here, just like a little side note. If your student needs the calculator as an accommodation, even if everybody in the class is using it, you need to note that on the IEP, because a general education student like the next year or the year after may not realize that your particular student needs that accommodation if it isn't written on the IEP. Sometimes a teacher will say, well, we don't need to note that because everybody in the class uses it. But really, if it's an accommodation for your student, you need to note it. Okay. Then we're going to use this side by side to compare. The two biggest differences between an accommodation and a modification are the learning outcomes and the grading. Schools that embrace accommodations and modifications in general curriculum classrooms are the most successful classroom. There are studies that show this. Some might even say that having appropriate accommodation and modifications are the cornerstone to successfully supporting all students in the classroom. As you can see on the table, accessing the curriculum and experiencing the curriculum are similar but have different outcomes. Accommodations and modifications are both tools to help students with learning differences to access the same work as their peers, but modifications are generally made for students with more complex learning needs, and the goal is to help them experience the same curriculum, not necessarily become a master at it. Accommodations have the same learning outcomes as the student's peers. Modifications have different learning outcomes. Both can happen in the general education classroom at the same time. Tools, materials, technology, visual aids, and timing are used to help the student with accommodation access the general curriculum so they can learn the same content as their peers. The students with modification is helped experience the curriculum but might not learn the same content. Grading is the same as their peers for a student with accommodations. Grading is different for other students with modifications. And just so you know, this table came from an article in the Inclusive Classroom. You can look it up if you need to.